Hey, you're ready to.
Mm. Hi everyone, my name is Andrade, as economist in the AUD, I also started PhD. I know that, so I will try to be fast and concise. So, yeah, my work is I'll be working with Anton Degren. It's modeling the macroeconomic and distributive consequences of pathways, and basically we are going to study in Colombia. And the idea is to kind of to have an integrated framework in which we analyze jointly macroeconomic and distributive issues in an empirical framework. We use some climate scenarios, but it's not properly like we have a climate model, so it's more for this scenario. So yeah. So I don't have to go too much through it, but at the end, with the department point at the world level, like, food systems are key to sustain like social development. They are key in terms of economic implications because they are at the beginning of supply chains. Nonetheless, they have different pressures, like on the demand side, but on the supply side related to climate change, native degradation, and biodiversity loss. And even if all countries are affected, I mean, country-specific dynamics are important. Like impact because the exposure of different level, the and I think it is a Colombia, this is the agricultural sector keeps being quite important in economic terms, like generating foreign exchange, for instance, in terms of export. This is still like reducing almost 20% or still a high share of the food budget. At the same time, there are a lot of like inequality covered in the rural areas. And finally, in terms of the environment, I think we're basically in terms of biodiversity and climate vulnerability. So I think it's kind of that's the departing point. And basically, like we frame the war in related risk literature in terms of what are the implications of kind of nature-related shocks and agriculture. It's basically the lead to supply shock dynamics, contraction in output, inflation in developing countries like pressure on the exchange rate and the BRP, and what it implies that it's typically tightened financial conditions and loss of purchasing power. But at the same time, like there are inequality impacts that we tend to overlook when we go into aggregate, and particularly like low-income households depend more on agriculture, on income employment side, but also in terms of consumption. And at the same time, the capacity to adapt the vulnerabilities is uneven. So what's important to take out of these two things? Because actually many of the implications of supply shocks are tied to monetary dynamics. And when you see the literature of agroeconomic models or models in the field, they are like CG or ESG models that basically they don't have monetary dynamics, so all the inflationary consequences and financial they can calculate. So and this is an example, for instance, in terms of relevance of agriculture in the income distribution, like low income households spend 3 times more on food than high income. But at the same time, when you go to this household surveys, you find like high dependence on the bottom sides in terms of employment or labor incomes. So what's the research strategy? Basically is to address like don't see what are the implications of outcomes like climate and food inflation. And the methodology basically we depart from country model that we developed, but we do an extension in terms of having a bit of sectoral granularity, like going with very micro dynamics, and having like household disaggregation. And what kind of contributions or gaps of the field or its losses? First, that there are a lot of macro financial and monetary dynamics. Then, when you have supply shock in developing countries, are important to address. Like, and I think there's a few frameworks used for that. Second, like the literature tends to focus more on distributive impacts of like energy prices, carbon tax, the direct damages since we get less. And finally, I think at the end we want to produce some scenarios or analysis that might be somehow relevant for the country because there are many studies in the field. Um, so the methodology, I mean, overall, like the work belongs to kind of James research program that kind of we developed different country-specific models for different countries to support policy dialogue about the low carbon transition. Depending on the country structure, we analyze different dimensions, whether climate-related damages, whether low carbon transition, we have some of the country, and the framework basically is SFC framework for continuous time because since the focus is developing countries, so there were a lot of status adjustments and this equilibrium is better capturing that, but it adds some complexities that not necessarily won't be the case. That it's better to go continuous and discrete. And finally, like dynamics, we particularly focus on the small economy issues in terms of gross financial flows and the exchange rate dynamics. So, and the model I want to show like equations is just more like a structure. So you have like the main sectors as normal models, sheets. And what's the particularity? Like in terms of household, like this type of household, like bottom 4 quintiles, because the deciles are like they are really homogeneous with complexity, but we kind of break the last quintile top 10, top 10. So, and we don't have a separation, we break it into other foods than non-food. I mean, we didn't see the point of having a very disaggregated IU structure for the non-food sector if the emphasis was on agricultural versus food dynamics. But because we break the productive sector and we break the household, so we think that there is a link between income distribution and the productive structure that we want to approve on it. And for the data, we break it in like different dimensions, but the main part is not essential. So we work with SNA, with UP, with fiscal statistics, the balance of payments, and the sectoral relying on supply frameworks, providing the system like the macro tutorial. And then for the distributional, it's like the part that is, for example, the growth part that we have been doing in this system. House is really useful in the sense that we have like social accounting matrices that they have like information by the side, but it's not the same methodology like the integrated accounts. So we need to do some harmonization and so on. On the consumption side, we rely on the surveys because we need to see how different households spend food, food, and this changed over time because, for instance, the English law and some of things. And also in the sum, we don't have like this sectoral income distribution, like how much of the agricultural income is paid to a household, like to the first decile, second decile, and so on, simply with employment. So with the household services, to do that. But then so it was kind of really comprehensive data work. I won't talk too much, but in the case of employment, like we look where households work by decile. So we classify them based on the sectors that employs the model. Wage income be associated mostly with formal wage contracts, like for formal workers, while in agriculture, like most of the employment is informal, so we look at the self-employed or non-formal employments to kind of associate with the mixed income, so it was kind of tied to the employment status. And in the consumption, we look at the household budget surveys. At the end, they are the surveys, the CPIs in the same. So this kind of a sketch of the structure. So we have like really high, like really detailed balance sheet. Colombia is not a financialized economy, so you look at it at the end basis. It's like loans targeted for the government, deposit, FDI, but it's like a very complex balance sheet in comparison to an economy like Brazil or Mexico that is more financialized. So, and the calibration approach, basically, like in many of the parameters of the macro sectorial and even the micro part, we can take them directly from the data, because at the end, what we do is there are a lot of technical coefficients like proportions and so on that at the end we can take directly from the data, but more for the dynamic equation blocks. Then these are, then we use a CMAF, a fitness algorithm that we kind of feed blocks, and then we try to do a system estimation, and we move to that. And we validate the model with official projections in the medium term, looking at the data, and also trying to start looking at cross correlation or correlation structure. So it's kind of the approach. And then I'm moving to the scenarios, and I think that's we spend a lot of time on it in the sense that we want to kind of connect with climate At the end, in agriculture, there are crop-specific dynamics, and this is a physical dimension, but we work in all the models in monetary, and what we call real is actually deflated values. So what we did was we have projections for different crops based on fall, and we look at crop by crop projections in tons. Nonetheless, in the supply table, what we need to have is kind of production at constant prices. And then we was extrapolated the projection by each crop to based on the constant price in export, and then we added up. But we accounted for the fact like how the crops are used is very important. It's not the same to have losses in production in export crops, like from exports a lot of commodities related to the agriculture sector, for instance, than to lose more, have more damages for crops that are used for final consumption or for intermediate consumption. So we did that. And how we do that? So basically, we went to this very far methodology and the models they use to do their projections, and we kind of went to do that decomposition in how they make the projections. So you have the harvested area dynamics, then you have the crop yield dynamics, and based on that, we kind of build out the scenarios, like trying to just change the environmental drivers of their projections, but not changing like technology, trying to keep it homogeneous. So we arrived for the scenarios, like kind of low climate change, it's kind of a proxy of RCP 4.5, then high climate change, it's kind of a proxy based on their assumption of RCP 8.5. Then a high climate change pessimistic, and then what we do is, even if we have a country model dynamic, there will be some implications. As we high variance about world food prices. So we use the word of costs at Potsdam, they have like some estimation of how much the world food inflation will increase next year. And at the end, while it's about them, they have like really going in Colombia, and I think they have a very high we land intensive. I would look at kind of basic table and some other institutions doing predictions in higher. That's what we call our basic, basically. So at the end, it's kind of summary of the things is we have crop by crop predictions, like by crop group, and we have like how much production will grow to in high climate change, low climate change scenario. But then we don't have a crop by crop model. So what we do is we aggregate because it's not internal, it's already constant prices. And we arrive to different growth rates. It's the cultural production that is used for final consumption, the one that is used for export, the one that is used for intermediate consumption. And the processed food export, that is basically coffee, is a bit of palm oil and so on. So at the end, this processed food export are tied to the world agricultural dynamics. So this is why they are also exogenous. But when you do these scenarios, you need to make scenarios about assumptions about world food inflation for levels you have, for level of productivity, population growth, GDP. So everything is the same. And actually, that's such an assumption that thinking that in different RCPs, we will have the same world GDP growth, the same world population growth, or the same productivity growth. But the idea is to keep it like tractable and just change one thing, or change, having like more this kind of approach of the socioeconomic pathways that they change too many things. That is not just climate, but also socioeconomic developments or technology. So we have to go in that direction. And yeah, so for the results, I will see because I have really small plots, so I think I will need to make some. But first, on the transmission channels. Think about it is when you have this kind of supply shocks in developing countries, of course you have that IC backward impact with the providers of input for the agricultural sector. You have a direct impact with the different government, but you have a trade in the fact that you need to import more. I think in most of the cases we will export less. And we have implication in the exchange rate, that the exchange rate impact on inflation, for instance. And also interest rates in terms of inflation, exchange rate dynamics of the interest rates. But there are a lot of like institutional factors that might amplify this kind of shock. So, for instance, the social transfer, institution, how is the wage set, or how is the work with inflation for the European countries, and in terms of spread, because of course we are losing production, but like in the case of export prices are larger. For instance, something like in city, you have like damages it's like but like the direction will go up. So it's kind of full sector framework that is really specific, depends on calibration, depends on kind of process. So, but at the end we have like sector dynamics, trying to calculate feedbacks, and here we have like some income distribution dynamics. So yeah, I will see. So it will be bit briefly. So at the end, what we get is like we have like really long-term scenarios. We don't have like actually that's what's relevant is like extreme weather events like biodiversity shocks that are really short-term because they're basically there are no estimations about it. We don't have like long-term trends. So you have different pathways of production, particularly. So this orange line is the high climate change scenario in which you have high world food inflation. This is just high damages, high RCP 8.5, and this kind of low climate change with high land use change without you're just using the fall assumption. So you have different growth rates in terms of production for the agricultural and processed food sector, and this sector is basically really labor intensive. So you have like higher the damages, lower employment, and this rises the unemployment rate. And you have inflation dynamics that is what we were interested, and you have three things going on. It's like first, you have shortages in production, so it rises the prices. Second, you need to import more food, and when you import more food, you have the exchange rate pressure. And on top, if you have to import like food that is systematically more expensive at the world level, then you have higher implications on it. And the external sector, you need to the import content of the demand, you need to import more in comparison with the scenarios when you don't have like high damages. Your import bill is larger, but at the same time you export less, so your trade balance starts to go down in terms of agriculture. And at the macro level, basically what you get is depreciation, higher damages, higher world food inflation, higher depreciation, real food consumption contracting, and you have all these macro impacts of contractionary monetary policy, lower profit rate, contraction in consumption, and also some implications on the fiscal side, like public debt, because of the sovereign debt cost rise, also country risk. And you have a little bit less growth, especially at the beginning of the scenarios, then it starts to narrow. And you have losses in per capita income in terms of lower growth, depreciation plus inflation. But then you want to see like how these losses are distributed. And because we have the income distribution disaggregation, basically, we are able to compute some synthetic indicators of income distribution. At the end, the Palma and the Gini, they look the same because the middle part of the distribution almost do not affect the Ginis, mostly what happens in the tails. And you see like higher damages, higher world food inflation, higher inequality, but why does it happen? So we try to take a look to the connection between income distribution and sectors. And basically, most of the job losses are in the bottom 4 quintile, in the top 2, in the bottom 40% of the population. So again, higher damages plus higher food inflation, higher employment losses. And what does it mean? It's like for this household, they get most of their income from employment and from employment in agriculture. So at the end, they have higher losses in terms of real income. But you have two different dimensions. It's a bit of how segmented labor market in Colombia. It's like wage income in the national account is more tied to formal wages. So like this kind of middle class workers that they are here, they tend to be a bit more affected. Nonetheless, mixed income in the national accounts in agriculture is mostly self-employment. So and self-employment, but also production for self-subsistence, how it's constructed. And you see that the damages are mostly, the losses are mostly here. And finally, like what the stock flow at a bit is like, you have households that, the net wealth of most of the household is negative. So when interest rates rise, they are more affected in terms of they don't have interest-bearing assets, but at the same time, they have lower savings because their income is falling. So at the end, you get like larger net property income payments. So this adds on the distributional part. So it's kind of feedback in that sense. And finally, you see like lower disposable income for the bottom, and why it's here is because basically we have to distribute the profits of the banks somehow, but this top 10, it's, I mean, the profit of the bank going to the 0.90909098, so I think it's kind of limitation of the SFC framework because we don't have segregation here. And you have losses in total consumption and food consumption at the end that are stronger. So the framework, and then we do, I won't spend like too much time on it because I already want to be short, but we did some policy scenarios, but we didn't do like an adaptation scenario, because I do think that when we talk about adaptation in agriculture, we need to really look at crop by crop dynamics and account for like water and land use change dynamics that with economic models we are not fully able to capture. So I think it's better to not do the adaptation because you just have higher production and then the problem is fixed. And we also didn't do like more kind of monetary policy tightening because at the end it's kind of cost push inflation. So we played a bit with the role of, having higher social transfers targeted to the bottom of the household of the population, and also having food subsidies for everyone. So kind of a targeted measure, but on the other hand, like subsidies for everyone, like non-targeted. And what we found is basically like in the social transfer scenario, you are better to reduce like the regressive impacts of climate change somehow. Nonetheless, you don't do anything with inflation because you are kind of doing a demand side thing. On the other hand, on the subsidy scenario, basically you are reducing the price level of the CPIs, which is important at the beginning, the starts to be less relevant, but in both cases, you see that there is kind of like compensatory mechanism of fiscal policy in terms of dealing with inflation. Nonetheless, the impacts are really small for the size of the policy because it's 0.3% of GDP, and the impacts are really short term. So at the end, if you want to sustain this kind of incentives, starts to be a bit like expensive on the one hand. So yeah, I'm just going to conclude. Yeah, I mean, we try to address like different dynamics in a. The model is complex somehow because it's really empirical and estimated to address like to reproduce the main macrofinancial dynamics, but we also have like kind of stylized agricultural sectors, and also the income distribution is really connected to the data, but it's not like we have like an ABM type with different heuristics and behavioral rules. It's more kind of Miyazawa type of analysis. So we are able to see results at the agri-food sector, at the macro level, but also on the distribution. And what we find like is permanent losses in production, losses in jobs. At the macro part is like to understand like the effect of supply shocks in agriculture in developing countries. We need to address monetary dynamics because there are exchange rate pressures, world food inflation that are financial and external fragility. And at least all these macro loops are very important because in the literature they are just partial equilibrium models without inflation money. And the distribution part is like all the losses that we see aggregate that are not maybe that important. When you look at the income distribution, they are really for the bottom. And yeah, so basically we try to integrate like a bit of biophysical, economic, and social dimensions. And in all the data work, we try to combine this idea of distribution and national accounts with the productive structure. And we highlight like a lot of challenges like macro, social, and sectorial. Nonetheless, we are really aware of the limitations, particularly with adaptation, because it's long-term scenarios assuming adaptation. And also we have a single agricultural good, and actually the footprints, the income distribution, the closure of the market are not the same. And I think we are missing like the key point, that is biodiversity and singular events. But yeah, so that's basically everything. So thanks a lot.
Yeah. Okay. Oh yeah. You have to take your notebook because my critiques are going to be formidable. But oh, yeah. No, I mean, I'm joking, obviously, because I have to be very constructive because I spent the past year working on this very model, but for Mexico. So it's an amazing model, and like no critics whatsoever. No, I mean, like, yeah, no worries. I'm joking. I'm going to try to be as constructive as possible. Like, first of all, of course, bringing like the pros, and the main strong points of the paper. I really like personally. I mean, I mentioned before that I work on green industrial policy with a focus on the global south countries, and the impacts of climate change and and climate change adaptation. And I think that the AFD, like the good AFD that I like to joke, there's a bad AFD that is in Germany, and this is the good AFD, which is it's like a bank, it's a development bank, like the World Bank, but still it's better than the German Nazis. I know that it's controversial to say that in Europe, but what I wanted to say is that it does amazing work, like they did a model on Vietnam, on Colombia, Tunisia, and this is like amazing work. And primarily, like I think it's a very good didactic exercise for policymakers, to tell them climate change is bad. You need to get to work right now as soon as possible, right? So we're working on Mexico, and it's very interesting work. I think that empirically, it's very, very well justified. I mean, the methods of estimation that they use. I'm not the calibrator, so I'm not actually telling myself that. I was just pulling data sets for the calibrator, but Devrin, Yilmaz, and Godin and the team are amazing modelers and calibrators, so that's great. In terms of the specific contribution of the paper, I mean, it's very important to add agriculture into full SFC macrofinancial framework. I mean, sometimes because I don't know, I do green industrial policy, we focus on manufacturing. You have all this regional input-output sectoral classifications, where agriculture is the #1 sector, and that's almost as an afterthought. But you cannot eat, I don't know, Tesla cars, you cannot eat trains, you cannot eat electricity, but you need food. It's one of the most basic things for thinking of ecological climate change questions. The agrarian question, the land question, it's extremely important. So that's a very important contribution on its own. And then also, I mean, after Yanni's affair was also like very good work on that direction. And also like introducing like within country household heterogeneity, like being able to capture the personal income distribution and the effects of climate change pathways into the personal income distribution is like massive, and it's very interesting to look at. So that's amazing, to rather than having a representative household. And of course, that's one of the main contributions of the paper is modeling food inflation in specifically, like the monetary financial transmission mechanisms that are implied in it. And that's massive. That's also very important as like the 2022 Ukraine-Russia war, that triggered massive skyrocketing in food prices in the whole world. So it's like a very, very important macroeconomic question for everyone. And also, I don't know if there are Americans in the room. I'm one of them. Food prices were also like one of the main beefs by which Biden was outvoted out of the White House. The inflation, and especially food inflation, like the egg prices, were really important. And also that's why like Trump has very little support, because he has not been able to stop the inflation. That has to do to trade wars and actual wars. And you can go to my paper, very good paper to talk about that, but that's another topic. So this combination is very, very ambitious, very powerful, and very sound, and I loved it, of course. Yeah, food inflation is very important. So now in terms, well, the conceptual strengths, yeah, food inflation as macrostructural, not sectoral noise, distribution of national accounts in certain SFC model, explicit external constraint, which a country like developing economy like Colombia, like modeling food imports, exchange rate pass-through, foreign reserves, and balance of payment pressures is just not optional. So it's very, very good model, of course. Jem, I'm sure that many of you have better critiques than, but so I'm going to do them. And then in terms of the weaknesses and the negatives, I mean, of course, I mean, yeah, like we can wish, like a great model, to do a lot of things. And I'm just going to pick some of the interesting paths to look into. First of all, that climate, like the modeling of climate economy feedbacks, you have these very well justified and motivated agricultural pathways, but they are entirely exogenous. But of course, I mean, depending on the carbon emissions that the whole of the world has, and like those interactions, like I think that it would be worth also to look at the climate damage function, and the feedbacks that go into it, and to try to really map that better, like not to treat that more endogenously. That would be, I think, amazing, not just treating it as a kind of exogenous context, So yeah, it's very deterministic in that sense. So we have no endogenous yield response, no feedback from capital deepening or degradation, and no ecological constraint tightening over time. And also another point that is related that you already mentioned is that there's no adaptation, but in agricultural technology, which is the focus of the paper, while, for example, like imports and trade are dynamic and can be adjusted smoothly, agriculture, which is the main issue, the main topic, is we don't treat adaptation, and I wanted to hear more your thoughts about why you didn't decide to include adaptation in agriculture technology that much, that why, like there's a very fixed technological coefficients and so on. And yeah, fixed technical coefficients in agriculture. So there's no labor shedding through mechanization, no input substitution under price pressure, and no endogenous intensification. Of course, I'm just, that's castle in the sky, it's very difficult to model, but they would love to hear about that. And then finally, I'm going to put my political economy hat and say that it's very good, like the personal income distribution treatment is perfect. I loved it. But what about the functional income distribution? And like here, I also wanted to talk to the rest of practitioners in this room that as Jan was mentioning before, the question of landlords, like who owns the land, who owns the natural resources, which in Colombia is maybe #1 issue, is extremely important. And like a lot of course, like SFC models built on the post-Keynesian tradition that you have like workers and capitalists, but especially with models like GEM that is explicitly tailored for global South countries, the landlord class is extremely important. And precisely in terms of like that will be the #1 reason why like prices increase, like Ricardo already mentioned that like 200 years ago. So I would beg, like have a very good paper that I'm going to publish maybe in 5 years, but trying to emphasize, like that the landlord class at the end and the rents that are involved in it are really critical, to try to understand, especially when working on ecological modeling, right? And then I will finish with that. Let me just look at the notes. No climate economy feedback, dynamic trade, static agronomy, and finally, oh yeah, like nature is rigid, but markets are flexible, and like human economy interactions can be better modeled in that sense. But the important thing is like the food system structure. I mean, I was like what about price controls? Price control measures, of course, the subsidies to food imports is one. But for example, one main policy, Isabella Weber mentions that a lot, is not about price controls, about fixing just a price control target, but having a buffer stocks. In fact, like the Minsky proposal of like a labor buffer stock, I mean, I'm sure you know better. Yeah, the employer of last resort, but we can have, what about a feeder of last resort? Like, I mean, Zohra Mamdani in New York was talking about public grocery stores, right? So I think that trying to look at policies, thinking about how to generate food sustainability for everyone, like a food guarantee, that makes sense, for guarantee program, like because Minsky took the idea from buffer stocks, right? So, and yeah, and then also, and I finish with small comment, like there's no retail sector, in that sense, to look at public groceries stores, but right now we are working on having a flexible industrial structure in the GEM model. So, playing with the sector classification may also be interesting, and we are going to give you the code very soon, I hope. But yeah, like no land use policy, no crop switching, irrigation investment, technological change, adaptation would be interesting. Sorry for not being concise. So,
yeah,
yeah,
try to be fun.
here. Sorry if I go concise.
It's okay. So, try to be fast. First, about the climate economic feedbacks is, I mean, Colombia is a climate technical country. So, of course, there's some local dynamics to the Amazon, but it's more connected to what happens in Brazil. And I do think that, I mean, I don't want to have a very economicist approach to deforestation and this kind of thing. So I prefer like to take it as exogenous, because I think the SFC framework is really good for the macro part. When we start going to the ecological part, we need to be more aware of physical dimensions. And I think that this is why we then go to adaptation, because if I have a single agricultural good, but actually we have 200 crops, the dynamics of adaptation in each crop is really specific to space, to resources, to how the crops are dynamics, like in the terms of technology and so on. So I think it's, if we don't have a crop model disaggregation connected to water, to land, I think it's no point, because I will have this very techno-optimistic approach, and I invest more in green capital, and then you will be more efficient, and then the problem is fixed. So I don't think it's relevant in the sense that we tend to oversimplify like how easy it is to adapt, and I think it's better to whether to work with couplings or better to just do more prospective scenarios rather to try to model everything, particularly like when the economic part is not the same as the physical part. About rents, yeah, I totally agree in the sense that, I mean, in Colombia has a Gini of land of 0.8, so it's kind of the land is owned by few people since the colonies and is getting worse. Nonetheless, if I'm doing empirical models, the national accounts that not disaggregate land. What you see in rents is kind of royalties, official royalties payments for natural resource use, like oil and stuff, but it's not land rent in itself. But I do think that is really relevant for climate, because at the end, like, you have different types of land, and the land that is less affected by climate, that is better located to water, will have differential rents with climate, because the prices will be by the less efficient. So I think theoretically it would be really nice to start going in this direction of more natural resource modeling. But I think empirically this type of measurements becomes hard. And if I want to talk about rent, I need a spatial dimension, a bit and different types of land. And again, it comes back like, is a purely economic approach the best to do it? But I really like all your comments, and particularly, yes, I think dynamics of adaptation, and especially about more creative policy scenarios, I would say that it's important to have it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Lorenzo. Sì, adesso lo apro. So Lorenzo's paper is also about Colombia.